Okay, and we are still in week 13, if I'm not mistaken, of the graphics and animation course. And today I'm going to add one more nugget in the list of wonderful pearls of wisdom having to do with dynamics. And the reason why we're doing dynamics is because it's a real helpful way of putting together your final animation. I'm going to explain exactly why that is as we go along. Okay, bullet dynamics, simulated real-world forces. Now, before you even get into this, you just got to realize that it's just doggone amazing what you can do. You can create all kinds of incredible real-world things in this simulated reality. It's more than just graphics. It's more than just logos. It can be basically, it can be games. It can be wonderful little cartoons. It can be little pockets of the universe that you create. But also, if you're looking at the final animation, this is just an easy way of doing it. So, let your animation make itself. Now, how much more simple could that be? Meaning that if you set something in motion that's interesting, that you can watch for 20 seconds, then you don't have to do the animation. The animation kind of does itself. And so what you're doing is you're setting up the forces and saying, go. Now, that's got to be fun. Now, of course, the caveat is, if all you're doing is rolling a ball down a hill, that may not be all that interesting. But if you make something like a pinball machine or something like that, then it is. Okay, so forces and dynamics are underrated. And I'll just confess to you that I talked to someone who was part of the inner circle of Lightwave, and he thought I was crazy for using all this dynamics in a project I was doing because he just believed it was easier to sort of control it from backstage. But the thing is, I don't necessarily see it that way. I think part of the thing that makes this interesting is the spontaneity of it, because you wouldn't think there would be spontaneity in a program like this, but there actually can be. So gravity, wind, and other forces can act on objects in predictable ways and unpredictable ways, meaning that you can actually set up an animation without knowing how it's going to end. So, for example, let's say we go back to the dice assignment. You got your dice. Let's say you've got 3 dice in your hand, or 3 dice in a cup. You empty the cup. The dice fall on the floor. You don't know what they're going to come up as until you actually see it, because the gravity is going to pull those dice onto whatever surface they're going to land on. They're going to bounce around, hit each other, bounce back, and everything else. And some of them might even go off the table altogether. How about that? Go off into the unknown abyss. But you don't know what the number is going to be until it actually happens. And the computer doesn't know either, because the computer doesn't even know that they're dice. But the idea is that it's an incredibly interesting process. Okay, these could be called happenings. You're creating functional art, things that happen, things that bounce off each other and stuff like that, using forces. And after a certain point, it becomes difficult, meaning there's some things that you would think would be easy that are not. And there are some things that are possible that I don't know how to do yet. There are also things that you might think are impossible that are actually amazingly easy. And I'll show you some examples. Okay, think of the possibilities. Let these ideas work through your mind, because I want you to have time to actually play around with it. And there is still time to do some of this, because as hard as it may be to understand, this is not necessarily difficult to do. It's just difficult to do really, really well if you want it. But I'm giving you all the tools that I know of, and again, you can go back and rewatch the lectures and pick up anything that you missed. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty, because I don't want to spend too much time on this. Types of objects. Now, types of objects in relation to bullet dynamics. They call it bullet dynamics. That's what it's called. And here they're referring to objects as bodies, but they're really objects. Okay, the first one is static bodies. Now, and it's important to understand why we're doing this. If you declare an object to be a static body, that object will never move. It will be anchored forever in that position. In fact, it will be anchored in a supernatural way. You could set off an atomic bomb next to it and it wouldn't move, because it can't. It's a static body. And so, most of your objects could be static bodies. Your floor could be a static body. Now, of course, let me say at this point that if you haven't even declared the object as a body of any kind, it's just going to sit there as well, but it won't have any substance. meaning that if your wall is not a static body, then anything can pass right on through it. It doesn't really, it doesn't have any substance. But if that doesn't come up, okay, meaning that you may have a ceiling that nothing ever hits. And it doesn't matter whether that's a static body or not. You can just leave it as an object. Okay, so a rigid body is something that has weight and mass and has substance. And so if a rigid body hits another rigid body, they will bounce off each other in some way. It will strike the body and it will form what's called a collision. And then whatever happens from that is based on mathematics. If a rigid body hits a static body, the rigid body will bounce, or the static body isn't going to move, but the rigid body will. That could be bouncing, it could roll, it could do all kinds of things. But rigid bodies move, and they basically only move based on whatever forces are acting on them. Parts bodies are kind of interesting. Parts bodies are intended to break. So, for example, if you've got a rock, and you declare that to be a parts body, then what you're going to want to do is go into Modeler and shatter it so that it actually has fragments. And when whatever force strikes that parts body happens, it will break and get pieces all over the place. And so if you want to break a wall or something like that, that would be the way to do it. It's not always easy, by the way, but it does work. Now, deforming bodies are kind of like Jell-O. Deforming bodies bend, they shimmer, they collapse, and so that's not always easy to do, but it can be done. You can have an object that kind of wobbles and wiggles and stuff like that because it's a deforming body. Now, a kinematic body is kind of like a cross between a static body and a rigid body. A kinematic body, you can animate that, you can move it. You can't really declare motion on a static body or a rigid body because the computer will be in conflict. It'll say, hey, wait a minute, I can't move that, it's static. Or if it's a rigid body, saying, hey, this is a force other than gravity working on this. And it's not always easy to do. So the kinematic body, if you want to create like a game of pool, the pool stick you would be kinematic. So you move the pool stick, it'll strike the cue ball will strike the other balls will strike the banks and the cushions or whatever. And then God knows what happens. And so those are different types of bodies. Now, types of forces. These are things that act on bodies. And these are things that you have a certain amount of control over. Gravity is the most basic one. Because gravity comes with the program. Everyone assumes that there must be gravity. And gravity is programmed to be similar to what we're used to on Earth. So that means that things want to fall down. And they want to fall down at a certain rate. And so you can change that. You can make the gravity similar to the moon, for example, or Mars, or Jupiter, or something else. Or you can reverse gravity, so things want to fly upwards if you want to. There's nothing you can't do. Force fields are things that you can control that act like gravity. You can pull things and push things and say, I want, whenever something goes by this, I want it to try to strike it, or I want it to be repelled by it. You know, kind of like holding a magnet up to something. You can do that. Collisions are when things hit stuff. And that generally happens when you're setting something in motion. And that's a kind of a force which will direct something to move if it isn't moving already, or stop something from moving. Wind is something that you can program, which you can create a hurricane, which will cause things to blow around, or something like that. Constraints are something relatively new. This is when you can create something like a spring, where you can have an object that's chained to another object, like a spring or something like that. So it'll bounce like a yo-yo. And so we're going to get into that in a later lecture. But these are the basics that we'll talk about now. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we doing all these things? Well, first of all, simulations can prove points. For example, if you want to prove the idea of the bell-shaped curve, you can do a simulation that would do that. It's easier than doing straight animation. If you look at an animation and you think of, if I'm going to move that ball this way, then it's going to hit this, and that's going to move like that. You got to do all that thinking yourself. That could take forever, and it may never look right. It's fun. There, I said it. It's fun. It's addictive. And so once you get started doing this, it can become like a great obsession. You can enjoy it. You can find it fascinating, and hopefully you will enjoy the experience. Leave time for rendering. That's my only warning to you, meaning that when you set up one of these animations for 20 seconds of good animation, that can take a while to render. And so don't do it the last day, because if you do, then it may not have time to render. Remember, you can also use more than one camera. You can get more than one angle of whatever it is that you're creating, and that can be fun. I wanted to show you a quick example of a simulation that involved using dynamics, and this is a relatively old one. But I want you to see what happens here. Here we have balls that are stacked up in a tube, and they're going into this machine here. And there's a little bit of problem with the initial state, but when the balls are released into this pegboard, you can see that the forces are acting on them. Gravity is pulling them down, and they can go anywhere, but they're forming what is called the bell-shaped curve, meaning that they're starting out in the middle, and they form that hump there. So basically, I proved the bell-shaped curve. And so that is an example of an animation. And of course, I didn't program any of this. And this is a more elaborate one that I do want to show you because it took me a long time to make. And this involves using forces. And you'll see we start out with this. Starts with the coin. Coin rolls down the ramp. Okay, so there you go. And why did I do that? Well, why not? I wanted to see how elaborate a happening I could create. And that was done a few years ago, and I've been working on some things since then. But the point is that even something simple, can be done, and you can do it. Okay, so here we're just going to do a very simple demonstration of dynamics, just to show you some of the things to get started with. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go up here and just basically make a couple of pieces. And the first thing we're going to make is a floor. And really that's about the extent of what we're going to do with our environment. So I'm just going to create a box, and this is something we've done before. And I'm just going to make it relatively large because I want to make sure that we have room to make this work. And I'm going to make that floor, well, it doesn't really matter how thick it is. I'm just going to pull that floor down like that, and that will be kind of like the tabletop on which things happen. And so for our next layer, we're just going to make an object, and for the fun of it, I'm going to make a ball. And you can see that's where the object, the floor is. I'm going to make the ball up here. And if I hit my numeric, I can establish how big I want it to be. I'm going to make this a relatively small ball. I'm going to make it 4 meters in all directions, and we'll make it a perfect sphere. But I'm going to do something else to it. I'm going to make it not exactly a sphere. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to reduce the number of sides that it has. And when I do that, it begins to take on a different shape. And so if I reduce it that much, you can see what we got here. This is kind of a weird shape. I don't even know what you'd call that. But if I reduce the number of segments, I can get something kind of triangular, like a kind of a diamond. And in fact, maybe we'll do something along those lines. So the reason why I want to do this is I want to make it a shape that's a little bit unusual, that can be unpredictable. And so I'm going to go with that. That's going to be not really a ball, but something kind of like a ball. And so that will be it for now. So I'm going to save the object, and I'm going to call this dynamics. And then I'm going to go into Layout, and I'm going to load the object, which I'm calling Dynamics, and you'll see it's basically all set. There's almost nothing going on that we haven't already seen before. And so all we're going to do is imply a few dynamics and see what happens. And we're going to go into the FX Tools tab up here. We can probably move this light because we don't really need that in the way. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll grab the floor, and if I were to turn that, if I go over to Dynamic Body, if I were to call that a rigid body, watch what happens. If it's a rigid body, as I move the timeline, the floor sinks. It will fall forever. And so I don't think we want to do that. So if I were to turn it into a static body, on the other hand, that table will never move. It will never go anywhere. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the ball, quote unquote, and I'm going to make that a rigid body. If I do that, let's see what happens. It falls. I give it some more frames. And right now, as you can see, this was unpredictable. I would have expected that to land on one of its sides, but it didn't. Maybe because it's still trying to think of itself as a sphere. But all hope is not lost. If I go into Image or Item Properties, we can see under Bullet Dynamics, we now have two objects, a static and a rigid. So I'm going to go to the rigid. I'm going to try a few things. First of all, I'm going to turn down the friction, which means I'm going to sort of grease it a little bit so it's more likely to move. I wonder if that would make a difference. Not yet. Okay, so I'm going to turn down some of these other things, linear damping. No, not yet. How about if I increase the bounciness? I make it a bouncy object. There, that did it. And so this is problem solving. Because to be honest, I'm not exactly sure why that worked, but okay. And so then, if I go to the static body, what if I were to decrease the friction of how that works, and see if that changes things any. And I'm going to increase the bounciness of that too, make it kind of like a racquetball court. If I make it really bouncy, ooh, that's maybe too much so, because that begins to look weird. And so that's what we're doing. We're kind of playing with the dials here. In fact, let's see if we can. Now let's say one of the problems that we're having with this is because it hits that point exactly on the table. What if we were to go back to Modeler for a second and simply rotate this a little bit? So if I go to Modify, Rotate, and I just rotate this object just a little bit so that its initial state is different. And maybe it needs to be rotated a little more. So I rotate it like that. So its initial state is different. That's beginning to look a little better. You see how that works? Okay, so what if I were to go to the world properties, which is all available in the same dynamic list, and what if I were to mess with gravity? Gravity is right now minus 9.8, which represents Earth gravity. And so what if I were to instead bring that gravity down, or I guess in this case it would be going the wrong way, so now we're a lot heavier. Notice how it settles a lot faster because gravity is heavier. So if I make that a minus number, oh, wrong way. That's what I was doing wrong in the first place. So let's make it kind of like what the moon would be, somewhere around -3. So that's the moon's gravity. Doesn't really make that much of a difference, I suppose. But what if I add a gravity somewhere else? If I add gravity to the side, notice how now suddenly it wants to do that. Maybe too much gravity. Okay, so why am I doing that? Just to show you that it can be done. So gravity is a force. In fact, if I make that a much smaller force, eventually I can get it to the point where it isn't strong enough to pull the object off the table altogether, even a small force of gravity. I'll just take it down a little bit more. And that'll probably be the end of that experiment. Okay, so I went ahead and set these back to reasonable parameters so we can see that the object behaves like a hard object when it bounces off of the table. So that's a rigid body. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to quickly change it to something else. Let's say instead of a rigid body, let's say I were to make that a deforming body. Deforming body. So when it does that, it doesn't appear to do anything because we haven't really changed it all. But, and let's get a little closer here so you can see it. What I want to do is mess with some of these things. Like for example, linear stiffness. Right now that's a very stiff object. If I were to bring that down a lot, let's see what that would do. Maybe not all that much. Let's take some of these other things down as well. Let's turn down its density. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Now it's too much problem. So let's give it back some linear stiffness. Okay, now the reason why this hasn't been working is a very fundamental one, and it's something that I probably should have known. And the reason is, it cannot, by definition, be a deforming object because it cannot be deformed. And you might not know why, but the reason is because I haven't given it enough geometry to work with. So I'm going to change something here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to another layer and create another ball. So if I create another ball here, I notice it's got the same parameters I originally had. But if I go to my numeric pad and give it back that geometry that I took away the first time, and so there, doesn't even matter what the dimensions are. I'm going to go with that. I'm going to save this object. And if I'm back here, you'll notice I've got another object, which I'll move this object over here, starting from there. And that will also be a rigid body. And so, well, this one I will change now to a deforming body. And if I turn down linear stiffness, you see how that behaves differently because now it can. So this was kind of a good teaching moment because in order to have deformations, you have to have geometry. So if I were to give it back some more of that linear stiffness, take it up to like 60%, see, it acts like kind of a deflated ball. So if I give it even more, say around 80%, see how that works? So I'm going to remove some angular stiffness as well. So it's got that kind of a look. Okay, so that's a deforming body. So I'm going to try one other thing. What if I were to bring this down so that it's just above that surface, and I'm going to put it underneath where that other object is. See what happens? And I'll give this some more time here. So if I give it enough time to think about it, you see at this point the computer has to do some quick calculations, but you can see, and if it gets sluggish, you just put it on a frame that's far away and let it think about it. So here we got, it strikes the object, bounces off it a little bit, not by much. So I'm going to go and I'm going to give it some shaper tension so that it doesn't really want to collapse, and see what that does. So make it a little stickier. Okay, and so that is enough to get us started. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because those are just a few examples of what you can do. And so again, this is the beginning of what you can do with dynamics, and I just want you to think about it for now. Play around with these things, because really that's the only way I can learn it. So I expect that if you are interested in challenging yourself, this would be a good way to get started.